Beneath Jerusalem's Temple Mount, one of history's most dangerous questions begins in near darkness. The Knights Templar lived close to the place medieval Christians believed was connected to Solomon's temple, and somewhere in that older memory was the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred object said to have rested in the Holy of Holies, then vanished from reliable history long before the Templars ever arrived. So the question is not simply, did they find it? The sharper question is stranger. What did their presence there allow later generations to believe? To follow that question, we have to slow down. Not because the story is small, but because it has been buried under centuries of certainty spoken too loudly. Jerusalem does not give up its past easily. It folds memory into stone, conquest into prayer, and absence into rumor. By the early 12th century, the Templars were not yet the grand, wealthy order that later Europe would fear and envy. They were a small brotherhood of armed monks, sworn to protect pilgrims, living in a city where every wall seemed to lean against scripture. Their quarters placed them near the heart of a landscape already heavy with longing. The Temple Mount, the lost sanctuary, the vanished Ark, the place where divine presence had once been imagined as almost physically near. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because what follows is not a treasure hunt in the usual sense. It is a story about proximity, silence, and the kind of mystery that grows stronger when proof disappears. Chapter 2. The object that disappeared from the record. Long before the Templars rode into the imagination of Europe, long before Crusader kings argued over Jerusalem, and long before medieval pilgrims walked nervously toward the holy city, there was an object at the center of Israelite sacred memory. The Ark of the Covenant was not, in the oldest traditions, just a religious treasure. It was not simply an ornate chest waiting for some future adventurer with a lantern and a conveniently translated map. To treat it that way is already to misunderstand it. The Ark belonged to a world where sacred objects were not decorations. They were signs of relationship, authority, danger, and presence. In biblical tradition, the Ark was connected to the covenant between God and Israel. It was associated with the sanctuary, with ritual life, with the journey of a people who understood holiness not as an abstract idea, but as something that could occupy a place, command a boundary, and make ordinary space tremble with meaning. The Ark was, in that sense, not merely kept somewhere. It changed the meaning of wherever it was kept. That is why its later connection to Solomon's temple mattered so deeply. When the temple was established in Jerusalem, the Ark became linked with the most restricted and symbolically charged space in that sacred complex, the Holy of Holies. This was not a public shrine. It was not a hall of spectacle. It was the innermost place, the place behind the veil, the space defined as much by who could not enter as by what was believed to dwell there. And here, already, the story becomes quieter than legend usually allows. Modern audiences often imagine the Ark in the language of discovery, a lost object, a hidden chamber, a dramatic reveal. But for the ancient world, the Ark's importance was not based on being lost. It was based on being present. Its power came from placement, from ritual, from the belief that the invisible could be anchored to a visible sign. The mystery begins not with treasure hunters, but with disappearance from the record. At some point, the Ark vanishes from reliable history. That sentence may sound simple, but it is one of the hinges on which the entire later legend turns. There is no secure ancient inventory telling us where it went, no confirmed inscription recording its removal, no reliable document saying it was carried into exile, buried beneath Jerusalem, destroyed in war, hidden by priests, or preserved in a secret chamber. Later traditions tried to answer the silence, because silence of that size almost demands an answer. But the evidence itself remains stubbornly incomplete. The most common historical setting for its disappearance is the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 587 or 586 BCE. That catastrophe ended the First Temple and tore through the political and religious world that had grown around it. The city was captured. The temple was destroyed. Sacred vessels and treasures were taken, lost, or ruined. In that storm of violence and upheaval, it is easy to imagine the Ark vanishing forever. But easy to imagine is not the same as proven, and this is where a careful storyteller has to resist the temptation to move too quickly. The destruction of Jerusalem provides a powerful explanation. It gives the disappearance a historical stage large enough to hold it. War, fire, conquest, exile. These are the kinds of forces that can erase even revered things. And yet, when we ask the narrower question, where exactly did the Ark go? The answer remains beyond our reach. Some traditions imply it may have been hidden before the Babylonians arrived. Others imagine it removed, concealed, or protected by those who understood what its loss would mean. Still others leave room for the possibility that it was destroyed or taken with other spoils. These traditions are not worthless. They tell us how later communities tried to make sense of an unbearable absence, but they are not the same as a verified trail. And that distinction matters, because the later Templar legend depends on a gap. It depends on the idea that something once central, once sacred, once guarded at the heart of the temple, could have slipped out of history without a final witness. If the Ark had a confirmed ending, the medieval imagination would have had far less room to work. A destroyed object can be mourned. A documented relic can be venerated. But a vanished one becomes something else. It becomes available to hope, available to fear, available to theology, politics, rumor, and eventually conspiracy. The Ark's disappearance did not create only an archaeological question. It created a symbolic vacuum, and vacuums have a way of drawing stories into themselves. The more sacred the missing object, the stronger the pull. The less certain the evidence, the more confidently people tend to speak. That is one of history's small ironies. The places where we know the least are often the places where legend talks the loudest. By the time the Templars entered Jerusalem more than 16 centuries later, the Ark was already ancient absence. It was not a fresh mystery. It was not something recently misplaced. It had been gone from dependable historical record for longer than the entire span between the Crusades and our own time. That scale is important. The Templars were not stepping into a case with warm evidence. They were entering a landscape shaped by memory, scripture, conquest, and longing. This is why the Ark could become so useful to later imagination. It belonged to the deepest layer of the city's sacred past, yet it had no confirmed resting place. It was tied to the temple, yet no one could point to it. It symbolized divine presence, yet its physical absence was undeniable. That contradiction is the engine of the legend. And the contradiction only grows stronger when we remember what Jerusalem was. This was not just any lost object in just any ruined city. The Ark was associated with the sanctuary at the center of biblical kingship and worship. The temple was associated with Solomon, with covenant, with sacred order, with a vision of a world arranged around divine authority. To possess anything connected to that world, even a fragment, even a rumor, would be to stand near one of the most potent memories in Western religious history. But the honest answer remains plain. After the destruction of the first temple, we do not have reliable records placing the Ark anywhere. That plainness can feel disappointing. It denies the easy thrill. It refuses the polished certainty of popular myth. Yet it also makes the story more interesting, not less. Because the mystery of the Ark is not just that it vanished, it is that its disappearance remained meaningful. The absence did not weaken the object's power. In some ways, it preserved it. Objects that survive can be measured. They can be displayed, disputed, damaged, restored, catalogued. They become part of the material world, subject to the ordinary humiliations of handling and debate. But the Ark, once lost to reliable history, became almost impossible to reduce. No one could fully possess it, and so everyone could imagine it. No one could verify it, and so no one could entirely kill the hope of it. That is the condition the Middle Ages inherited. Not an ark waiting clearly beneath a floor. Not a treasure chest with a continuous chain of custody. Not a secret confidently passed from priest to knight across the centuries. What survived was more elusive, a sacred object with a vanished ending, attached to a place that would be fought over, reinterpreted, and renamed again and again. And when armed monks finally came to live near the old temple precinct, the silence around the Ark did not remain neutral. It began to act like an invitation. Chapter 3. A city conquered, a memory reawakened. When Jerusalem fell to the armies of the First Crusade in 1099, the city did not become newly sacred. That is too simple a way to tell the story. Jerusalem had already carried centuries of prayer, memory, argument, grief, and longing before the first Crusader banner appeared above its walls. What changed was control, and control has a way of changing how memory behaves. For the Crusaders, Jerusalem was not merely a military prize. It was the destination of a vow, the answer to sermons preached across Europe, the earthly stage of sacred history. Men who had crossed seas, mountains, hunger, fear, and disease did not look at the city as a neutral place. They arrived already carrying an image of it in their minds. Jerusalem of Scripture, Jerusalem of pilgrimage, Jerusalem of the Passion, Jerusalem imagined from pulpits and manuscripts by people who had never seen its light. Then suddenly, it was real. That collision between imagination and stone is one of the most important things to understand. The Crusaders did not simply occupy a city. They stepped into a landscape already crowded with meanings, and then began arranging those meanings around their own victory. Streets became routes of devotion. Buildings were renamed, repurposed, interpreted. Places known within Islamic tradition were folded into Christian geography. Older Jewish memory remained beneath everything, not erased by conquest, but often ignored, misunderstood, or claimed through another language. The Temple Mount stood at the center of this transformation. To modern ears, the phrase can sound almost too familiar, as if it names one fixed thing. But in Jerusalem, sacred places are rarely only themselves. They are also layers. what stood there, what was believed to have stood there, what later communities remembered, what conquerors renamed, what pilgrims hoped to touch, and what rulers needed others to believe. The Temple Mount was not just a raised platform of ancient stone. It was a place where Jewish memory of the temple, Christian readings of biblical history, and Islamic devotion had all become inseparable from the physical landscape. By the time of the Crusades, the Ark of the Covenant was already far beyond reach as a documented object. But the place associated with its deepest memory had not vanished. That mattered. The temple could be gone, the Ark untraceable, the ancient rites ended, and still the geography remained powerful enough to pull new stories toward it. That is one reason Jerusalem feels different from other conquered cities in medieval history. Many cities were taken, renamed, fortified, taxed, defended. But Jerusalem had the dangerous quality of making politics feel eternal. A king ruling there was not only administering territory, he was standing inside sacred narrative. A soldier guarding a gate was not only guarding a gate, he was protecting access to a place that generations had imagined as the center of the world. This did not make the Crusader kingdom stable. In some ways, it made it more fragile. The more sacred a place becomes, the harder it is to govern as ordinary ground. Every shrine carries memory. Every memory can become a claim. Every claim can become a wound. For Christians in the West, the conquest of 1099 reawakened biblical geography with a force that is difficult to overstate. Names that had lived in Scripture now appeared in letters, chronicles, charters, and pilgrim reports. Bethlehem, the Mount of Olives, the Holy Sepulchre, the Jordan, and Jerusalem itself were no longer distant words heard in church. They became places that armed men, monks, merchants, nobles, and pilgrims could imagine entering with their own bodies. The effect was intoxicating, but it was also selective. Crusader Jerusalem was a city interpreted through victory. Its rulers inherited buildings and spaces shaped by earlier Islamic rule, including some of the most sacred Islamic sites in the world. Yet instead of seeing these places only within the traditions that had formed them, Crusaders often recast them through a Christian biblical lens. This was not unusual for the medieval mind. Sacred geography was not mapped with modern archaeological caution. It was mapped through scripture, authority, tradition, and need. Need may be the least romantic word there, but perhaps the most revealing. A conquered city must be explained. It must be justified. It must be made legible to those who sacrificed for it and to those expected to keep supporting it from far away. The Crusader kingdom needed Jerusalem to be more than a possession. It needed Jerusalem to confirm that the enormous violence and expense of crusading had produced something holy. The landscape itself became evidence in an argument. So the Temple Mount, already heavy with Jewish and Islamic significance, entered a new political imagination. For the Crusaders, it evoked Solomon, the ancient temple, and the grandeur of biblical kingship. Even when their identifications were shaped by medieval tradition rather than modern historical precision, the emotional force was real. To live near that site was to live beside a memory of divine order, royal authority, and sacred loss. This is the world into which the first Templars would emerge. Not a world of clean categories, but one of overlapping claims. Not a quiet archaeological zone, but a charged religious landscape where stone could become argument and proximity could become power. The question of the Ark had not yet become a Templar conspiracy. That would take time. But the conditions that made such a legend possible were now in place. A vanished sacred object, a conquered holy city, a platform associated in Christian imagination with Solomon's temple, a society hungry for signs that heaven had approved its victory. And soon, a small brotherhood of armed men would be given a home close enough to the old temple memory that their identity would be changed by it. This is where the story begins to narrow, not toward proof of a hidden relic, but toward the making of an association. The Ark did not need to be found for its absence to become useful. The temple did not need to survive intact for its name to carry authority. Medieval Jerusalem was full of such transformations, where memory could be stronger than masonry, and a place could become more powerful precisely because so much of it had been lost. That is the strange atmosphere of Crusader Jerusalem after 1099. It was a city of possession, but also of insecurity. A city claimed loudly because it could never be claimed simply. Beneath each act of devotion lay an older devotion. Beneath each new name, an older name. Beneath each certainty, the pressure of another tradition refusing to disappear. And beneath the temple memory, still unreachable, was the silence left by the Ark. Chapter 4. The Poor Knights of Solomon's Shadow. The first Templars did not enter history as men surrounded by gold, hidden archives, or forbidden relics. They began, at least in the tradition that later remembered them, as something much smaller and more vulnerable. A narrow brotherhood of armed Christians trying to solve a practical problem in a conquered land. Pilgrims were coming to Jerusalem. That may sound peaceful, almost gentle. But pilgrimage in the early 12th century was not a comfortable spiritual holiday. The roads beyond the city could be dangerous. The Crusader victory of 1099 had taken Jerusalem, but it had not magically made the surrounding landscape safe. A holy city could be held behind walls, while the roads leading to it remained exposed to ambush, fear, hunger, and ordinary human disorder. So around 1119 or 1120, a small group formed around Hugh de Paynes. The surviving accounts of these early years are not as full as later legend would like them to be. The beginning of the order comes to us through memory shaped after the fact, when the Templars had already become famous enough for people to look backward and give their origin a cleaner shape. Still, what we can say with more confidence is that this brotherhood was created to protect Christian pilgrims, and that its identity developed in the charged atmosphere of Crusader Jerusalem. At first, their mission was not mysterious. It was almost brutally plain. Guard the road, escort the vulnerable, serve the new Christian kingdom with sword and vow. Yet this plainness is exactly what makes the later myth so interesting. The Templars were not born as a conspiracy. They became available for conspiracy because their ordinary mission placed them in an extraordinary location. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem gave the Brotherhood quarters near the area medieval Christians associated with the Temple of Solomon. This was the detail that changed everything about how they would be remembered. A small order of armed pilgrims' guardians might have faded into the crowded history of the Crusades, but a small order living in the shadow of the temple, that was different. That gave them a name, a setting, and eventually a legend. Their full early identity would be tied to the temple itself, the poor knights, or poor fellow soldiers, of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Even the name carries a contradiction. Poverty and knighthood, Christ and war, humility and the memory of a royal sanctuary. It sounds almost impossible, and perhaps that is why it endured. The men around Hugh de Paynes were stepping into a medieval world that loved symbols but did not treat them as decoration. A name was not just branding. A location was not just real estate. To be associated with Solomon's temple was to be placed inside a sacred story larger than any individual knight. The Brotherhood did not need to claim the Ark. They did not need to uncover a golden chest beneath the floor. Their proximity alone was enough to charge the imagination. This is the point where modern myth often runs ahead of the evidence. It looks at the Templars near the Temple Mount and immediately imagines secret digging, hidden chambers, relics wrapped in cloth, documents passed by candlelight. The temptation is obvious. The geography seems almost too perfect, but history is rarely obliged to fulfill the mood we bring to it. The stronger observation is quieter. The Templars were given a position that fused military service with biblical memory. That fusion made them more than guards. It made them occupants of a symbolic threshold. They protected pilgrims in the present, while living beside the imagined remains of sacred antiquity. They served a crusader king while taking their identity from a temple associated with ancient kingship. Their home turned their mission into a story, and stories, once attached to institutions, can outlive the people who first carried them. For Baldwin II, granting them quarters was likely practical as well as symbolic. The young crusader kingdom needed disciplined defenders. It needed reliable men who could move between devotion and violence without seeing the two as enemies. It needed new forms of service adapted to a frontier world where prayer and military danger lived very close together. Hugh de Paynes and his companions answered that need. But for later generations, the practical explanation was never quite satisfying. It felt too small for the place. How could men live near the supposed memory of Solomon's temple and not encounter something? How could they spend their days in that landscape and remain only guards? How could poverty, secrecy, sacred geography, and armed brotherhood not conceal a deeper purpose? Those questions reveal more about the power of the setting than about the evidence. The Temple Mount worked on the imagination because it was already a place of accumulated meaning. Jewish memory, Christian interpretation, and Islamic sacred architecture overlapped there in ways that no crusader institution could fully control. The Templars inherited that intensity simply by being housed nearby. Their poverty also played a role in the story's later magnetism. Poor knights make better legends than comfortable administrators. A small band of men with few possessions, sworn to service, living beside one of the most symbolically charged sites on earth. It is almost impossible for later storytellers to leave them alone. Their lack of early wealth made their later rise seem more suspicious. Their humble beginnings made the growth of their influence feel like evidence that something must have been discovered, learned, or hidden. But the more careful reading is that institutions can become powerful without a secret relic at their center. They can grow because they answer a need, attract donors, receive approval, develop discipline, and occupy a place in the moral imagination of their age. The Templars began at a moment when the Crusader world needed exactly what they offered: holiness that could carry a sword. That idea was new enough to disturb and useful enough to flourish. Hugh de Paynes stands at the entrance to this story not as a sorcerer of hidden knowledge, but as the founder of a form. He helped shape a brotherhood that made armed protection into a religious vocation. The scandal was not that they secretly found the Ark. The scandal, at first, was that they made fighting look like devotion. And then came the place. Without the temple association, the order would still matter. With it, the Templars became almost mythological before the conspiracy theories even began. Their name carried the weight of Solomon. Their headquarters placed them near the lost sanctuary. Their mission connected danger on the roads with salvation in the city. They were poor men living under the richest possible symbol. That is why their origin matters so much. It shows us how a legend can begin without anyone lying. A king gives quarters. A brotherhood takes a name. A sacred landscape lends its memory. No ark has to appear. No hidden chamber has to open. The myth begins in the gap between a practical arrangement and the symbolic force of the place where it happened. The Templars were formed to protect pilgrims, but by living near the old temple memory, they also became guardians of something far less tangible: the medieval imagination of Jerusalem itself. Chapter 5. Living above the lost sanctuary. The place given to the Templars was not an empty ruin waiting politely for medieval imagination to decorate it. It was a living, sacred landscape, already claimed by centuries of devotion before the Crusaders tried to rename it into their own story. Their headquarters stood in what had been the Al-Aqsa Mosque, on the southern side of the Temple Mount. To the Crusaders, this area was associated with the Temple of Solomon, and that association mattered more than architectural precision. Medieval people did not always separate a place's physical history from its sacred meaning with the caution a modern historian might prefer. They moved through geography as if memory itself had weight. So imagine the strange arrangement. A small brotherhood of men sworn to poverty, discipline, and protection takes up residence in a place tied, in Christian imagination, to one of the most powerful buildings in the Bible. Beneath them, or near them, or simply around them in the charged air of the city, was the memory of the lost sanctuary. And somewhere in that memory was the Ark. Absent, unproven, unreachable, but never emotionally gone. This is where the legend begins to feel almost inevitable. Not because there is reliable evidence that the Templars found the Ark. There is not. That sentence needs to stand firmly in the middle of the story. No verified record places the Ark in their hands. No dependable medieval document shows them discovering it beneath the Temple Mount. No object has surfaced that can close the question. But legends do not require proof in order to grow. They require atmosphere, timing, and a space where certainty cannot enter. The Templars had all three. Their daily life must have been far less glamorous than later myth suggests. There would have been training, prayer, administration, patrols, repairs, meals, arguments, fatigue, and the plain discomforts of military religious life. Men do not remain mysterious to one another when they share quarters for long. Someone always snores. Someone always complains about food. Even sacred history has to make room for laundry. And yet, the larger setting transformed the ordinary. A sleeping mat was not just a sleeping mat when placed near the remembered temple. A guard post was not only a guard post when it stood in a city where every stone seemed to have a theological claim attached to it. The Templars did not need to perform mystery. The place performed it for them. That is the key detail often missed in popular retellings. The power of their headquarters was not simply underground. It was symbolic. To live above, beside, or within the old temple association was to inhabit a kind of sacred echo. Whether they searched below the surface or not, they were already positioned inside a story about what had once been hidden from ordinary eyes. The Ark had belonged, in tradition, to the innermost space of the ancient sanctuary. It was not an object of public display. It was associated with restriction, danger, holiness, and separation. The Templars, too, became defined by restriction. They were a closed brotherhood. They had vows. They had rules. They answered to religious authority in ways that made them unusual among warriors. Even before wealth and suspicion gathered around them, their way of life encouraged outsiders to imagine that something inward was being guarded. This does not mean they possessed a secret. It means their identity made secrecy believable. There is a difference. A historian asks what can be demonstrated. A legend asks what feels fitting, and few things have ever felt more fitting to later storytellers than the idea of armed monks sleeping near the lost sanctuary of the Ark. The image has a terrible elegance. Poverty above treasure. Silence above revelation. Men sworn to obedience above a place associated with divine presence. It almost writes itself, which is exactly why we should handle it carefully. Because when a story feels too perfect, it may be telling us more about desire than evidence. The Templars' residence on the Temple Mount did not prove a discovery. What it did was place them at the intersection of visible power and invisible memory. Above ground, they were servants of the Crusader kingdom. Around them stood the architecture of conquest and devotion. Beneath the idea of the place lay older histories that no Crusader could fully possess: the Jewish temple, the Islamic sacred landscape, the Christian imagination of Solomon. These did not cancel each other out. They accumulated. That accumulation made the Templars seem larger than themselves. A different order, housed in a less suggestive corner of Jerusalem, might have become respected without becoming mythic. But the poor knights lived where biblical memory had already prepared the world to expect hidden things. The temple was a place of veils, inner chambers, sacred vessels, priestly access, and catastrophic loss. Once the Templars took their name from it, every later suspicion found a ready-made stage. And still, the most honest image is not of men prying open a secret chamber and lifting out the Ark in triumph. It is quieter than that. It is the image of men living their difficult religious routine in a place whose meaning exceeded them. Perhaps some wondered what lay below. Perhaps some heard local stories. Perhaps some saw old stones, reused spaces, cisterns, passages, or fragments they could not fully interpret. That would not be surprising. Jerusalem was full of remains from earlier ages. But curiosity is not discovery, and architecture is not evidence of a relic. What we can say is that their headquarters trained the imagination of everyone who heard about them. The name Templar did not point only to a military function. It pointed to a place, and that place pointed backward, toward Solomon, toward the Holy of Holies, toward the Ark, toward the unresolved wound of sacred disappearance. That chain of association was more durable than stone. Over time, the order's location became almost a silent credential. It suggested depth. It suggested antiquity. It suggested access. People far away in Europe, who would never stand on the Temple Mount, could imagine these men as living closer to biblical mystery than any ordinary Christian. They were not just defenders of pilgrims. They were residents of the threshold. And thresholds are dangerous in stories. They are places where one world touches another, visible and hidden, past and present, faith and politics, evidence and longing. The Templars lived on such a threshold, and later generations could not resist turning that fact into a key. But perhaps the real key was never made of metal. Perhaps it was the setting itself. To live above the lost sanctuary was not to possess the Ark. It was to become permanently associated with the possibility of possession. And in the long life of legend, possibility can sometimes do more work than proof. Chapter 6. The birth of the excavation legend. At some point, the Templar story moved below ground. It is not hard to see why. The Temple Mount was never only a surface. Beneath its visible courts and buildings lay older layers, cavities, cisterns, passageways, foundations, and the stubborn remains of earlier construction. Jerusalem is a city where the ground itself seems reluctant to be only ground. Every descent suggests another century. Every blocked opening feels like it might be protecting more than air. And once the Templars were remembered as men who lived near the old temple precinct, later imagination did what imagination often does. It asked what they might have done there when no one was watching. This is where the excavation legend begins. According to later claims, the Templars searched beneath the Temple Mount for hidden relics, sacred vessels, lost documents, or some secret connected to the ancient sanctuary. In the most dramatic versions, they were not merely guards of pilgrims at all, but patient diggers beneath Jerusalem, uncovering something so powerful that it explained their later wealth, influence, and strange aura of secrecy. It is a compelling story. It is also, as evidence, extremely thin. That does not mean every underground rumor was invented from nothing. The Temple Mount contained subterranean spaces. Medieval Jerusalem was filled with reused structures, old masonry, water systems, and places whose original purpose could be misunderstood or reinterpreted. The Templars living in that area may well have encountered architectural remains. They may have used existing spaces for storage, water, access, or practical needs. None of that would be surprising, but there is a long distance between noticing old stones and discovering the Ark of the Covenant. The legend grows in that distance. Part of the problem is that underground spaces have a special power over the human mind. A room above ground can be inspected, entered, described, disputed. A chamber below ground can remain suggestive forever. Even when it is empty, it does not feel empty in the same way. Darkness gives the imagination permission. Restricted access gives rumor a place to hide. And beneath the Temple Mount, restriction was not merely practical. It was sacred, political, and emotional. That combination is almost perfect for legend making. A holy site with layered traditions, a military order with vows and internal discipline, a vanished biblical object, a city conquered by men who believed sacred history was unfolding around them. Add underground passages, and the story begins to assemble itself. The difficulty is that later storytellers often confuse narrative elegance with historical evidence. The Templars were at the Temple Mount. The Ark was associated with the ancient temple. Therefore, the Templars must have searched for it. And if they searched, perhaps they found it. And if they found it, perhaps that explains everything that came later. Each step feels small. Together, they build a staircase into the dark. But a staircase is not proof. What we can say is more restrained, and in some ways more revealing. The Templars occupied one of the most suggestive locations in medieval Christendom. Their connection to that place invited speculation. Later generations, especially those fascinated by hidden knowledge and secret orders, looked back at the order's early years and found a blank space where documents were scarce. Into that blank space they placed excavation. The story answered a need. It gave physical action to a symbolic association. It turned proximity into purpose. It made the Templars not merely residents of the temple memory, but active seekers beneath it. That shift is crucial. A man who lives near a mystery is interesting. A man who digs beneath it becomes dangerous. And the Templars, after their fall, were remembered as dangerous men. Their later reputation changed how their early history was read. Once an institution has been accused, destroyed, and wrapped in secrecy, even its ordinary beginnings start to look suspicious. A headquarters becomes a cover. A vow becomes a code. A lack of evidence becomes a sign that evidence was hidden well. This is one of the strange traps of conspiracy thinking. Absence stops being absence and becomes proof of concealment. The Temple Mount made that trap even stronger, because this was not just any inaccessible place. It was a sacred landscape where access had always mattered. The ancient Holy of Holies was defined by limitation. The Ark itself, in tradition, belonged to a world of boundaries. The later Islamic sacred character of the site added further layers of reverence and restriction. Crusader reinterpretation did not erase those depths. It only added another claim over them. So when people imagined the Templars digging, they were not imagining ordinary excavation. They were imagining trespass into a forbidden memory. That is why the legend remains powerful even when the evidence fails to support its boldest claims. It speaks to a suspicion older than the Templars themselves, that sacred places hide their most important truths below the visible surface. It flatters us too, because it suggests that history is not difficult because it is fragmented, but because someone has hidden the missing piece. Real history is usually less tidy. Records vanish because parchment decays, archives burn, wars scatter communities, rulers rewrite priorities, and people fail to preserve what later centuries wish they had. The past is not always a locked chest. Sometimes it is simply broken, but the Templar excavation legend refuses that ordinary sadness. It offers instead a thrilling alternative. Someone knew. Someone found something. Someone carried the secret away. That emotional structure is stronger than almost any footnote. And yet, if we are being careful, we must keep returning to what can be said without overreaching. There is no verified discovery of the Ark by the Templars. There is no reliable record proving they uncovered hidden biblical documents beneath the Temple Mount. The more elaborate versions of the story come later, shaped by the Order's fame, its downfall, and the enduring romance of secret wisdom. Still, dismissing the legend entirely would miss its deeper meaning. The rumor of excavation tells us what people believed the Templars were close to, not necessarily physically close to a golden relic, but symbolically close to the buried authority of the biblical past. The underground spaces mattered because they gave form to that feeling. They allowed the invisible to become imaginable. They turned spiritual proximity into a possible route, a tunnel, a chamber, a sealed door. The legend was born because the setting asked to be interpreted. In another city, an armed religious order might have been remembered through battles, donations, and rules. In Jerusalem, near the Temple Mount, it could not escape older questions. What had been here? What had been lost? What had been hidden before the conquerors came? What might still remain below the feet of men who prayed and trained above it? The answers were uncertain. The questions were irresistible. And so the excavation legend took root, not as proven history, but as a kind of historical dream. It was the dream that beneath conquest lay revelation, beneath discipline lay secrecy. Beneath the headquarters of poor knights lay the explanation for their future power. Perhaps they found old stones. Perhaps they found nothing. Perhaps they found enough fragments of the past to understand that the Temple Mount's true force was not buried in a single chamber. It was everywhere. And once the world believed the Templars had gone searching beneath Jerusalem, it became almost impossible to believe they had come back empty-handed. Chapter 7. What they could have found. The most famous version of the Templar mystery is also the least useful one. It imagines a single moment of discovery. A stone lifted, a hidden chamber opened, a breath held in the dark. Then, at the center of it all, the Ark of the Covenant, waiting exactly where legend needed it to be. Gold intact, power undiminished, history reduced to a dramatic reveal. It is a beautiful image in the way impossible images often are. But it may distract us from the more interesting question. What if the Templars did discover something beneath or around the Temple Mount, but not an object that could be carried away? What if the real discovery was not a sacred chest, but a kind of authority? A recognition that certain places can turn memory into power, and that proximity to holy ground can shape the imagination of whole societies. That would be less cinematic in the ordinary sense. No glittering relic, no triumphant procession, no sealed box carried through the night. But historically, it may matter far more. The Templars lived in a world where sacred geography was not decorative. Places carried force. A shrine could draw money across continents. A relic could justify pilgrimage, patronage, war, and prestige. A monastery that possessed the bone of a saint was not merely storing human remains. It was holding a claim on devotion. A city associated with biblical events was not just old, it was spiritually charged territory. Jerusalem was the greatest example of this. The Templars did not need to find the Ark in order to understand the power of standing near its memory. Their headquarters placed them close to a site that medieval Christians associated with Solomon's Temple, and that association gave their order a symbolic depth no ordinary fortress could provide. They became tied not only to protection, but to origin. Not only to service, but to sacred antiquity. That was a discovery of a different kind. It was the discovery that location could become theology. A military brotherhood housed elsewhere might have been respected. A military brotherhood connected to the temple could be imagined as chosen, entrusted, perhaps even initiated into something older than itself. That difference did not require fraud. It did not require a secret ceremony in a hidden chamber. It required only a medieval world ready to read meaning into place. And that world was very ready. The Middle Ages had a deep hunger for physical links to sacred history. Relics mattered because they seemed to collapse distance. A fragment, a cloth, a stone, a body part, a vessel. These things promised contact with holiness across time. They made the invisible touchable. They allowed ordinary believers to feel that the past was not gone, but concentrated somewhere. The Ark, as an absent relic, became even more powerful in imagination than many relics that could actually be seen. A visible relic can disappoint. It can be doubted, damaged, duplicated, stolen, or exposed as ordinary. But a missing relic remains perfect. No one can inspect its craftsmanship too closely. No one can prove the wood has rotted. No one can point to a crack in the gold. Absence protects it from decay. The Templars were close to that absence. That may be the real engine of the story. They occupied the edge of an unresolved sacred memory. Whether they found architectural remains, reused stones, ancient cisterns, inscriptions they could not fully understand, or nothing at all. Their presence near the Temple Mount allowed later people to imagine them as witnesses to something hidden. The actual material facts may have been modest. The symbolic consequences were enormous. This is where the word "found" becomes slippery. To find something does not always mean to lift an object into the light. Sometimes it means to recognize a system. The Templars may have learned, simply by existing in Jerusalem, how power moved through holy places. They saw pilgrims arrive exhausted and transformed. They saw donations flow towards sacred causes. They saw kings and churchmen speak of land as destiny. They saw how a location could turn violence into mission and poverty into prestige. That is not a conspiracy. It is institutional education. And the Templars learned quickly. Their later rise was built on discipline, approval, patronage, and practical usefulness. But beneath those ordinary causes was something more psychological. They had a story people wanted to believe. They were knights, but not merely knights. Monks, but not merely monks. Poor in vow, yet linked to the richest symbolic landscape in Christendom. Their identity joined contradictions that medieval society found both inspiring and unsettling. The Ark fit into that identity almost too well. It represented divine presence, hidden law, sacred kingship, and dangerous holiness. The Templars represented armed devotion, institutional secrecy, and the defense of a conquered holy land. Put the two together, even as rumor, and the combination becomes irresistible. It does not matter that the evidence fails to prove possession. The association feels meaningful enough to survive without proof. That is how many legends endure. They do not survive because they are well documented. They survive because they explain feelings that facts alone leave unresolved. People looked at the Templars and saw a problem. How did such a small brotherhood become so powerful? How did men sworn to poverty become entangled with wealth? How did a religious military order gain such unusual privileges? How did a group once lodged near the temple become a force across Europe? The sober answers involve politics, papal support, donations, military need, and administrative skill. But sober answers rarely satisfy the myth-making part of the human mind. A hidden discovery feels more elegant. It compresses complexity into a secret. And so the Ark becomes a key that unlocks everything, even when history refuses to hand us the key. A careful reading suggests something subtler. The Templars did not need the Ark to become powerful. The legend needed the Ark to make their power feel explainable. Their real treasure may have been their position within a sacred narrative. They stood at the meeting point of scripture, conquest, pilgrimage, and institutional ambition. They learned that holiness could organize men, money, violence, and memory into a structure strong enough to cross borders. That is a more troubling discovery than a golden chest. A relic, if found, belongs to a chamber, a shrine, a treasury. But the authority of sacred geography spreads. It enters charters, sermons, donations, recruitment, fear, and loyalty. It changes how people imagine obedience. It makes an institution seem older than its founding and deeper than its records. So when we ask what the Templars could have found, the answer has to remain open in the material sense. Perhaps they encountered fragments of earlier buildings. Perhaps they explored underground spaces. Perhaps they saw enough of Jerusalem's layered past to feel its weight more directly than most Europeans ever could. Or perhaps they found no object of importance at all, but symbolically, they found a place where absence itself had become powerful. That is why the Ark stayed attached to them in later imagination, not because proof was strong, but because the silence was useful. The missing object gave shape to suspicion. The Temple Mount gave it a setting. The Templars gave it faces, vows, swords, and an institution that would later become rich enough, secretive enough, and tragic enough to carry the story forward. In the end, the most plausible discovery was not buried under stone. It was the realization that a lost sanctuary can still command the living. Chapter 8. The Order that Learned Power. Power rarely arrives all at once. More often, it gathers quietly, one permission at a time. A gift of land here, a donation there. A noble family seeking salvation through generosity. A ruler needing trained men on a dangerous frontier. A churchman willing to bless a new form of discipline because the old categories no longer seem large enough for the age. This is how the Templars changed. They began as a small brotherhood formed to protect pilgrims, but the world around them soon discovered that such men were useful in more ways than one. They could fight. They could pray. They could hold property without passing it to heirs. They could move across borders under the prestige of sacred mission. They could attract donations from those who would never see Jerusalem, but who wanted some part of their wealth to travel there in spirit. And because their cause was attached to the Holy Land, giving to them could feel like touching the sacred from a great distance. That was one of the Order's greatest advantages. The Templars did not have to persuade every donor with strategy or politics. They stood for something larger and more emotional. The defense of holy places, the protection of pilgrims, the fragile Christian presence in Jerusalem and beyond. For a knight in France, a widow in England, a count in Spain, or a lord nearing death, a gift to the Templars could become a way of entering the sacred drama without crossing the sea. The result was transformation. Over time, the poor knights became owners of estates, farms, mills, vineyards, churches, and urban properties. They developed commanderies across Europe. They held castles in the Levant. They became part military order, part religious institution, part international network. Their wealth did not appear by magic, and it did not require the Ark of the Covenant to explain it. It came through patronage, privilege, and the unusual trust granted to men who claimed no private family future. A Templar did not marry. He did not build a dynasty for his children. He did not, at least in theory, accumulate wealth for himself. That made the order a powerful container. Property given to it remained inside the institution. Generation after generation could build on what the previous generation had received. This is one of the least mysterious explanations for their rise, and therefore one of the most often ignored. A secret relic is dramatic. Compound institutional advantage is not. But history has a weakness for the unglamorous. It often turns on legal arrangements, inheritance patterns, tax privileges, administrative habits, and the ability to keep records better than your rivals. The Templars were not merely warriors in white mantles. They were organizers, and organization, in a violent age, can look almost supernatural to those outside it. Their castles mattered too. In the Crusader states, Stone was not just defense, it was a statement of endurance. A fortress could control roads, protect territory, and project confidence into a landscape where confidence was always under pressure. The Templars became associated with these hard places of the frontier, where faith and military calculation met without apology. But their European houses were just as important. They formed a web behind the war. Money, horses, supplies, recruits, letters, and obligations could move through that web. The order learned how to survive not as a single household, but as a system. And systems are difficult for outsiders to understand. This is where admiration begins to darken into suspicion. A small group with clear poverty is easy to love. A vast organization with land, money, privileges, and internal rules is much easier to fear. The Templars' success changed the meaning of their secrecy. In the beginning, secrecy may have looked like discipline, the ordinary privacy of a religious brotherhood. Later, when wealth gathered around them, the same privacy could look like concealment. The order's internal life was structured by vows and hierarchy. That was normal for a religious institution. Yet because the Templars were also soldiers, their discipline carried a sharper edge. They did not fit comfortably into the usual imagination of monastery or army. They were both, and because they were both, people could project almost anything onto them. That ambiguity was powerful. A monk who owns nothing but belongs to an institution that owns vast estates is already a contradiction. A knight who fights under religious vows is another. An order that claims humility while negotiating with kings becomes something stranger still. None of this proves hidden treasure, but it explains why hidden treasure became easier to imagine. The more powerful the Templars became, the more people searched backward for a secret beginning. This is a pattern we should recognize. When an institution rises quickly, later generations often look for a single cause, a hidden document, a forbidden technique, a pact, a discovery, something that turns complexity into a story with a keyhole. But the Templars' rise was not one event. It was accumulation. Their power came from being useful to the crusading movement, trusted by donors, protected by religious authority, and skilled at turning scattered gifts into durable structure. Still, the temple memory clung to them. Their headquarters in Jerusalem had given them a name and an aura. Their growth across Europe gave that aura weight. Now the order was no longer only close to sacred geography. It was wealthy enough to be suspected of having profited from it. The legend adjusted itself accordingly. Perhaps, people could imagine, they had not simply learned the value of sacred place. Perhaps they had uncovered something there that gave them knowledge, legitimacy, or leverage. The evidence does not require that leap. But the human mind enjoys making it. By the later 12th century, the Templars were no longer poor in any ordinary institutional sense. Individual brothers might live under strict rules, eat plainly, and own little personally. The order itself, however, had become a major force. That distinction mattered then, and it matters now. Poverty as a vow did not mean poverty as a balance sheet. A man could sleep under discipline while his institution managed wealth across kingdoms. To critics, that looked like hypocrisy. To supporters, it looked like efficiency in the service of God. Both reactions tell us something. The Templars became a mirror in which medieval society saw its own unresolved tensions: wealth and salvation, violence and holiness, obedience and independence, humility and influence. They were not frightening simply because they had money. Plenty of religious houses had money, They were frightening because their money moved with armed discipline, sacred prestige, and unusual autonomy. That combination made them formidable, and once an institution becomes formidable, its past is never allowed to remain simple. Every early silence becomes suspicious. Every privilege becomes evidence of hidden favor. Every lost record becomes a missing confession. The Templars' rise did not prove that they found the Ark. It made the idea more emotionally satisfying to those who needed their power to have a secret source. But perhaps the truth is more revealing. The Templars learned power by serving a world that wanted holiness to be defended, financed, and organized. They learned that a sacred mission could attract wealth without admitting ambition. They learned that distance from Jerusalem could be bridged by donations, vows, and symbols. They learned that an order born near the temple could carry that association far beyond the city itself. The Ark remained missing, but the machinery of belief was very real. And by the time Europe began to look at the Templars with unease, the order had become something far more dangerous than a band of men guarding roads. It had become an institution with memory behind it, money beneath it, and enough silence around it for enemies to begin filling in the gaps. Chapter 9. Faith, War, and the New Knighthood. The Templars were powerful because they were useful, but they became unsettling because they made a contradiction look holy. A monk was supposed to withdraw from the violence of the world. A knight was supposed to live inside it. One renounced bloodshed, the other trained for it. One sought salvation through obedience, prayer, and discipline. The other was judged by courage, loyalty, and skill with weapons. Medieval society understood both figures. It had categories for both. The Templars blurred them. They did not simply hire soldiers to defend monks or ask knights to donate money to monasteries. They created a form of life in which the same man could pray like a monk and fight like a warrior. That combination feels familiar now because history has repeated the image so often. But in the early 12th century, it required justification. It needed a language strong enough to make violence seem not only permitted, but sanctified under the right conditions. This is where Bernard of Clairvaux becomes important. Bernard was one of the most influential religious voices of his age, and his support helped give the Templars moral shape. He did not make them powerful by himself, but he helped explain them. He offered a way of seeing the armed monk not as a grotesque contradiction, but as a disciplined servant whose violence was bound to obedience and sacred purpose. That distinction mattered. A knight fighting for pride, plunder, or private revenge was spiritually dangerous. A knight fighting under religious discipline, in defense of pilgrims and holy places, could be imagined differently. The sword did not cease to be a sword, but the story around it changed. And stories around violence matter. They decide whether bloodshed is remembered as crime, tragedy, duty, or sacrifice. They decide whether a warrior is feared, condemned, admired, or blessed. The Templars entered that dangerous space and survived there because the Church eventually gave their way of life approval. They were not wandering fanatics inventing holiness for themselves. They became an institution with rule, recognition, hierarchy, and spiritual permission. That made them stronger. It also made them more disturbing. Because once violence has been made holy, it does not become less violent. It becomes harder to question. The Templars' discipline could inspire admiration, but it could also create dread. These were not ordinary soldiers who might be dismissed as rough men of war. They were men wrapped in religious purpose, protected by sacred language, and trained to obey. Their identity carried the weight of both altar and battlefield. To supporters, that was precisely the point. The world was dangerous. Pilgrims needed protection. The Christian presence in the Holy Land needed defenders. Ordinary knights were often unruly, divided by ambition, and attached to family interest. A military order promised something cleaner. Men without heirs, bound by vows, placed under command, and directed toward a cause larger than themselves. To critics, or even to uneasy observers, the same qualities could look severe. A man who gives up ordinary life and places his body entirely inside an armed religious institution becomes difficult to read. He is not fighting for a wife, a castle, or a son. He is fighting for an idea, and men who fight for ideas can appear either noble or terrifying, depending on where one stands. The Templars were not the only religious military order, but they became the most magnetic in memory because their contradictions were so sharp. They were poor men who helped manage wealth. They were monks who rode to war. They were servants of the church who, over time, gained privileges that could make them seem almost beyond ordinary control. They took vows of humility, yet moved among kings and nobles. They guarded pilgrims, but also held fortresses. They renounced the world, yet became deeply entangled in its politics. None of this requires a hidden arc to explain it. In fact, the contradiction itself explains much more. The medieval imagination was fascinated by purity and corruption, by holiness and danger, by the possibility that the same institution could be chosen by God and compromised by power. The Templars stood in exactly that tension. Their official identity was disciplined, approved, and sacred. Their public reality was wealthy, armed, and influential. That gap invited interpretation, and interpretation, over time, can become accusation. The supportive figures like Bernard helped sanctify the new knighthood. It gave the Templars an ideal image, not violent men using religion as a cloak, but religious men submitting violence to obedience. Whether every brother lived up to that ideal is another question. Institutions are always messier than their rules, but the ideal mattered because it gave donors confidence, recruits purpose, and rulers a language for using military force without making it seem merely political. That was the brilliance of the order. It transformed anxiety into mission. The Christian knight, often criticized for pride and worldly aggression, could be reimagined as a penitent warrior. The monastery, usually removed from battle, could become a command structure. Poverty, normally associated with withdrawal, could become a tool of military discipline. The Templars did not erase contradiction. They organized it. But organized contradiction is still contradiction. The more the order succeeded, the more visible the tension became. Their houses accumulated property. Their commanders negotiated. Their treasuries moved money. Their castles required strategy. Their brothers fought and died. Around all of this stood the language of spiritual purity. It was not hard for suspicion to grow, especially among those who resented their privileges or feared their autonomy. This is why the Ark rumor fits them so easily in later imagination. The Ark was also a symbol of dangerous holiness. It belonged to a sacred space not open to everyone. It suggested divine authority, guarded presence, and consequences for improper approach. The Templars, in their own medieval way, seem to embody a similar pattern. Holiness guarded by restriction, power held behind vows, authority hidden inside discipline. Again, this does not prove contact between the order and the ark. It shows why the association felt emotionally convincing. The Templars became dangerous in the imagination not because people knew what they hid, but because people believed they were the sort of men who could hide something. Their vows made privacy sacred. Their hierarchy made silence normal. Their battlefield courage made them formidable. Their wealth made them resented. Their church approval made them difficult to challenge. A simpler brotherhood might have remained admirable. A weaker order might have remained harmless. But the Templars became both sanctified and strong, and that combination rarely stays innocent in public memory. The new knighthood offered a solution to one problem and created another. It answered the need for disciplined defenders of holy places. But it also raised a question medieval society never fully settled. What happens when the instruments of war are placed under the language of holiness and then given land, money, and independence? The answer was the Templars. Not monsters, not magicians, not proven guardians of the Ark. Something more historically unsettling. Men whose approved devotion made their power appear righteous, and whose power eventually made their devotion appear suspicious. Chapter 10. The Ark as Medieval Obsession. The Ark survived in medieval imagination because it was never only an object. That is the first thing to understand. If it had been merely a chest, however ancient or beautiful, its disappearance would still have mattered, but it would not have possessed the same gravity. The Ark belonged to the deeper category of things. Objects that seem to hold more meaning than their physical form can contain. In tradition, it was tied to covenant, to divine presence, to law, to kingship, to the most restricted chamber of the sanctuary. It was associated with nearness to God, but also with danger. Not the soft danger of mystery novels and treasure maps, but the older, religious danger of holiness approached wrongly. That made it unusually powerful as a medieval symbol. The Middle Ages did not think about sacred objects in the detached way a museum label might. A relic was not merely interesting. It could draw pilgrims, heal reputations, enrich churches, settle rivalries, elevate towns, and make distant communities feel connected to the drama of salvation. The physical world was full of possible contact points with heaven. Bones, cloth, splinters, vessels, stones, all could become charged by association. But the Ark was different. Most relics pointed to saints, martyrs, or events within Christian memory. The Ark pointed further back, into the older biblical world that Christianity inherited, interpreted, and claimed as part of its sacred history. It carried the weight of Israelite worship, Solomon's temple, royal legitimacy, and the mysterious presence of God hidden from ordinary sight. For medieval Christians, that made it both ancient and strangely intimate. Not Christian in origin, but deeply woven into the story Christians believed had prepared the way for Christ. So any rumor connecting the Ark to the Templars would have been almost impossible to resist. The order already had everything a legend required. It had a name linked to the temple. It had a headquarters near the place medieval Christians associated with Solomon's sanctuary. It had vows, hierarchy, secrecy, wealth, and military discipline. It had risen quickly enough to make enemies wonder what force had fed its growth. To attach the Ark to such men was to fuse two charged mysteries into one. The result was not evidence. It was magnetism. And magnetism matters in the history of belief, not because it proves the thing believed, but because it explains why belief keeps returning after proof fails. The Ark offered an answer to several medieval anxieties at once. It explained power. It suggested hidden legitimacy. It implied that the Templars' authority might not have come only from papal approval, donations, or battlefield usefulness, but from contact with something older, stranger, and more absolute. That is why the Ark works so well in the legend. It is not just treasure. Treasure is too small. Gold can make men rich, but it cannot easily explain awe. The Ark could. To imagine the Templars finding gold beneath the Temple Mount is to imagine a financial secret. To imagine them finding the Ark is to imagine a spiritual secret, a political secret, and perhaps even a cosmic secret. It would mean they had stood in the presence of the most dangerous memory of the ancient sanctuary. It would mean they had become custodians of something that kings, priests, and empires had lost. That possibility was intoxicating. It also gave shape to a suspicion that was already waiting for a symbol. The Templars were too wealthy for men of poverty, too armed for monks, too independent for servants, too sacred for ordinary politics, and too political for simple holiness. The Ark allowed all those contradictions to gather around a single image, a sealed chest, a hidden law, a forbidden presence, a secret beneath the temple. It is worth pausing over how efficient that image is. It does the work of an entire argument without needing to explain itself. Once the Ark appears in the imagination, the Templars no longer need to be understood through charters, donations, estates, military needs, and ecclesiastical privileges. They can be understood through possession. They had something. They knew something. They were changed by something that is easier to grasp than institutional history. It is also less reliable. The evidence still refuses to cooperate with the legend. No verified record tells us that the Templars found the Ark. No dependable inventory lists it among their possessions. No credible chain of transmission follows it from the Temple Mount into Templar hands. The story lives not because the trail is strong, but because the symbolic fit is so powerful. And symbolic fit can be dangerous. When a rumor feels meaningful, people often mistake that feeling for truth. The Ark feels as though it belongs in the Templar story, because both are built around sacred restriction. The Ark belonged to the hidden center of the ancient temple. The Templars belonged to a closed religious order. The Ark represented divine authority guarded from ordinary access. The Templars represented armed holiness guarded by vows and rule. The Ark vanished. The Templars later fell under accusations and secrecy. The parallels almost invite belief, but parallels are not proof. They are patterns the mind enjoys. Still, to dismiss the obsession as foolish would be too easy. Medieval fascination with the Ark reveals something serious about how people understood authority. A king could rule by inheritance. A pope could command through office. A noble could dominate through land and arms. But the Ark suggested a deeper kind of legitimacy. Authority that came from divine election, from sacred history, from the place where heaven and earth were believed to touch. For a crusading society, that mattered intensely. The Crusades were not only wars for territory. They were wars wrapped in claims about holiness, penance, protection, and rightful possession. The question of who could claim sacred space was never merely geographic. It was theological and political at once. In that world, the Ark became a perfect symbol for the ultimate claim. Not just control of Jerusalem, but contact with the divine memory beneath Jerusalem. The Templars did not have to possess it for the association to benefit and haunt them. That is one of the strange truths of legend. Sometimes a rumor gives power before it gives danger. The idea that the Templars were close to ancient secrets may have deepened their aura. It made them seem less like ordinary soldiers and more like men stationed at the edge of revelation. But the same aura could turn poisonous. What looks like sacred privilege in one century can look like hidden corruption in another. The Ark, then, was not just an obsession because it was lost. It was an obsession because it explained too much too elegantly. It could make the Templars' rise seem destined, their secrecy meaningful, their wealth suspicious, their downfall inevitable. It could turn an institution into a myth with a single missing object at its heart. And that is precisely why we should be cautious. The Ark's greatest power in the Templar story may be the power it has over us. It tempts us to prefer the dramatic center over the difficult web. It asks us to trade slow historical causes for one luminous secret. It makes absence feel like concealment and coincidence feel like design. But if we resist that temptation, the story becomes richer. The Ark remains missing. The Templars remain fascinating. And the obsession itself becomes evidence of something real. Not that the Order found the sacred chest, but that medieval people understood how dangerous a lost symbol could be. A missing relic can command imagination more completely than a relic placed behind glass. And in the case of the Ark, the empty space it left behind was large enough for the Templars to disappear into. Chapter 11. Jerusalem lost. The myth deepens. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 changed the Templar story in a way no excavation legend ever could. Until then, their name had been tied not only to an idea, but to a place they could physically inhabit. The temple was not just a memory attached to their title. It was part of their lived geography. They had occupied a charged position in the Holy City, close to the landscape medieval Christians associated with Solomon's Temple. And that proximity had given their identity a strange kind of weight. Then Saladin took the city. For the Crusader world, the loss was not merely strategic. It was spiritual, emotional, and symbolic. Jerusalem had been the proof that crusading sacrifice could seize sacred history and hold it behind walls. Its conquest in 1099 had been remembered as triumph. Its loss in 1187 felt like a wound opened in the very center of the crusading imagination. The Templars survived, of course. The Order did not vanish with the city. They remained a military and institutional force, with castles, estates, commanderies, and influence stretching across the Levant and Europe. But something essential had shifted. They were no longer men living at the old temple site. They became men who had once lived there. That difference is enormous. A present location can be visited, questioned, observed, envied. A lost location becomes memory, and memory, especially when mixed with defeat, tends to darken and deepen. After Jerusalem was gone from Crusader hands, the Templars' early association with the Temple Mount became less ordinary, not more. Distance made it purer. Loss removed the everyday details. No one far away had to imagine repairs, meals, schedules, practical administration, or the dull labor of maintaining a headquarters. They could imagine instead the Order's first years as a vanished episode beside the hidden heart of biblical history. Absence improved the legend. This is one of the quiet laws of historical myth. When a place can no longer be easily accessed, it becomes easier to fill with meaning. The Temple Mount, already layered with Jewish, Christian, and Islamic significance, now stood outside the daily reach of the Crusader institutions that had tried to claim it. For Western Christians, that loss did not erase its sacred power. If anything, it intensified longing. The city became not only holy, but lost wholly, a more painful and politically useful condition. The Templars were caught inside that longing. Their identity had been born in the Crusader kingdom's first fragile decades. They had helped embody the promise that the Holy Land could be defended by disciplined religious warriors. When Jerusalem fell, that promise did not disappear, but it became harder to believe without strain. The Order's continued existence now carried a hint of failure as well as duty. They were guardians of a sacred project that had suffered its greatest humiliation. And here, the legend finds new nourishment. If the Templars had once lived near the place associated with the Ark, and if Jerusalem was now lost, then whatever they had seen, found, suspected, or carried away could be imagined as already beyond recovery. The city's loss created a perfect veil. No skeptic could simply walk into their old quarters and demand an answer. No curious noble in Europe could inspect the early rooms and settle the matter. The physical setting that anchored the rumor was now separated from the Order by war, religion, politics, and grief. The lack of proof became part of the story. This is not how evidence works, but it is often how legend works. A missing document becomes suspicious. An inaccessible site becomes suggestive. A silence becomes not a silence, but a sealed mouth. The fall of Jerusalem did not prove that the Templars had discovered anything beneath the Temple Mount. What it did was make their possible discovery feel permanently unreachable. That is a powerful transformation. Before 1187, the idea of Templar secrets could still be imagined as local, attached to buildings and spaces they occupied. After 1187, the secret became mobile. Perhaps it had been carried away before the city fell. Perhaps it had gone with the Order. Perhaps if there was an object, a text, or a memory, it had moved into the Templar network of castles and houses. The legend no longer needed to remain under Jerusalem. It could travel. And the Templars were perfectly designed to carry such rumors. They were international. They had houses across Europe. They moved men, money, messages, and supplies. Their internal discipline made them seem capable of coordinated silence. Their religious status made them difficult for outsiders to penetrate. Their military purpose gave them reasons to relocate valuable things. Nothing in this proves the existence of a hidden relic, but everything in it gives rumor a believable body. The Order became a road system for imagination. This is where the Ark's absence begins to echo differently. Earlier, the missing Ark created the mystery. Now, the lost city protected it. The question was no longer only, where did the Ark go after the destruction of the first temple? It became, in later imagination, where might the Templars have taken what they found before Jerusalem was lost? Notice the shift. It is subtle, but important. The legend moves from ancient disappearance to medieval custody. It suggests a handoff that no reliable evidence confirms, and yet, emotionally, it satisfies a need. It keeps the sacred object from being merely lost. It gives it guardians. It gives it motion. It gives it a secret history. The Templars did not have to encourage this directly. In fact, there is no need to imagine them whispering elaborate claims about the Ark. Institutions often become mythic against their will. Their enemies, admirers, donors, chroniclers, and later storytellers do the work for them. A powerful order with a dramatic past is never allowed to remain only itself. After Jerusalem's fall, the Templars carried the aura of men who had been close to the center and survived its loss. That made them useful symbols and easy targets. To some, they remained heroic defenders of a holy cause. To others, they began to look like custodians of a failed dream. Wealthy warriors who had not saved the city, they were sworn in spirit to protect. Defeat has a way of changing how people interpret power. When things go well, privilege looks like reward. When things collapse, the same privilege starts to look like guilt. The fall of Jerusalem did not immediately destroy the Templars, but it changed the emotional weather around them. Their continued wealth and autonomy could now be measured against the loss of the very city that had given them their name. If they had been granted so much, why had the holy city been lost? If they were so disciplined, why had the Crusader project failed at its symbolic heart? These questions were not always fair, but history does not require resentment to be fair before it becomes dangerous. The Ark legend benefited from that resentment. It allowed people to imagine that the Templars had saved something, even if they had lost Jerusalem, or, more darkly, that they had preserved their own secret while the public cause collapsed. The same rumor could flatter or accuse depending on who told it. That flexibility made it durable. A heroic version says the Templars recovered a sacred treasure and protected it from enemies. A suspicious version says they concealed a power they had no right to hold. A romantic version says they became guardians of forbidden knowledge. A sober version says none of this is proven, but the conditions were perfect for such stories to grow. The sober version is the one we should keep closest. Jerusalem's loss deepened the myth not because it revealed new evidence, but because it removed the original setting from ordinary reach. The Temple Mount became more distant, the Templars more enigmatic, and the Ark more available to imaginative rescue. Whatever had not been proven before could now be hidden behind the catastrophe of history. If they found anything, it disappeared with them. If they found nothing, the silence looked much the same. And in that resemblance between secrecy and emptiness, the legend found room to breathe. Chapter 12. The Fall That Created the Conspiracy. The Templars were not destroyed because someone proved they had found the Ark. They were destroyed in a world where power, debt, fear, and political necessity could dress themselves in the clothing of moral outrage. By the early 14th century, the order was no longer the young brotherhood of Jerusalem's dangerous roads. It was old, wealthy, privileged, and vulnerable in a new way. The Holy Land had been largely lost to Latin Christian power. The original crusading purpose that had given the military orders their clearest meaning had become harder to defend with the same confidence. The Templars still possessed land, money, prestige, and independence. But prestige without a clear battlefield can begin to look like excess. And excess attracts rulers. Philip IV of France was not a man inclined to leave useful wealth beyond his reach. His conflict with the Templars cannot be reduced to a single motive, but political pressure and financial hunger were central to the atmosphere. The French crown was powerful, ambitious, and often in need of money. The Templars, with their estates and financial operations, made an irresistible target. Rich enough to be worth attacking, separate enough to be accused, and strange enough that accusations could stick. The blow came suddenly. In 1307, Templars in France were arrested under royal authority. The charges were horrifying: denial of Christ, obscene rituals, idolatry, corruption, secret ceremonies, and other claims designed not merely to accuse the order, but to make it spiritually untouchable. These were not minor allegations. They were crafted to turn the Templars' greatest strength, their closed religious identity, into evidence against them. A private rule became a hidden cult. Discipline became conspiracy. Silence became guilt. This is one of the most important transformations in the entire story. The Templars had always been somewhat difficult for outsiders to read. Their internal life was structured by vows, hierarchy, and ritual, as religious life often is. But under pressure, ordinary privacy could be made to look monstrous. The very fact that outsiders did not fully know what happened inside the order allowed hostile voices to describe it in the darkest possible terms. Then came torture. Confessions extracted under torture have to be handled with extreme caution. They tell us a great deal about fear, pain, and the needs of interrogators. They tell us far less by themselves about what actually happened. Some Templars confessed to shocking things. Some later recanted. Others denied the accusations. The record is uneven, damaged by coercion, and shaped by the machinery of prosecution. But in public memory, the damage was done. Once a sacred institution is accused of secret corruption, it becomes almost impossible to restore its innocence completely. Even if the evidence is weak, even if the confessions are forced, even if the motives of the accusers are political, suspicion leaves a stain that argument cannot easily wash away. The Templars' fall was especially powerful because it inverted their image. Men who had been praised as defenders of holy places were now described as enemies of the faith. Men who had been trusted with donations were now portrayed as corrupt hoarders. Men who had worn the language of obedience were accused of practicing hidden rebellion against the very religion they claimed to serve. That reversal was dramatic enough to outlive the legal case itself. Under pressure from the French crown and the wider crisis surrounding the order, the papacy eventually moved toward dissolution. In 1312, the Templars were officially suppressed. Their property was largely redirected to other religious purposes, especially to the Hospitallers. Though the process varied by region and was tangled with politics, the institution that had once seemed almost permanent was dismantled by decree, and from that ruin, the conspiracy was born. Not immediately in the full modern form, with every symbol polished and every theory arranged into a labyrinth, but the essential ingredients were now present. A secretive military order, a headquarters once associated with Solomon's temple, sudden arrests, terrible accusations, torture, recantations, political pressure, dissolution, wealth redistributed, leaders disgraced, records incomplete, an ending dramatic enough to feel unfinished. History had produced a perfect vessel for hidden meanings. The order's destruction changed how people looked backward. Their early years in Jerusalem no longer seemed merely suggestive. They seemed like the first act of a concealed drama. Their wealth no longer seemed only the result of donations and privilege. It could be imagined as the fruit of some hidden discovery. Their vows no longer looked only like religious discipline. They could be recast as a code of silence. This is how downfall creates conspiracy. It does not simply add new claims. It rearranges old facts into a darker pattern. A powerful institution that continues to exist can answer accusations, manage its reputation, discipline its members, and preserve its archives. A destroyed institution cannot speak with one voice. Its enemies speak loudly. Its defenders speak fragmentarily. Its silence becomes permanent. And because the Templars were dissolved rather than simply reformed, the empty space they left behind became available to anyone who wanted to explain it. The Ark entered that space naturally, not because the trials proved anything about it. They did not. The accusations against the Templars were not reliable evidence that they had found the Ark beneath Jerusalem, but the fall made such theories easier to imagine. If the Order had been destroyed under such strange and violent circumstances, perhaps later minds wondered, the official reasons were only a surface explanation. Perhaps the real cause was something hidden. Perhaps they knew too much. Perhaps they possessed something kings and popes could not allow them to keep. That kind of thinking is seductive because it gives moral structure to chaos. It makes political greed look like a cover for cosmic danger. It makes torture and opportunism feel like clues in a larger design. It turns the ugliness of power into a puzzle. But the more sober reading is no less disturbing. The Templars did not need to hold the Ark to be destroyed. They needed only to be wealthy, vulnerable, unusual, and politically useful as a target. Their secrecy did not have to conceal a lost relic. It only had to be opaque enough for enemies to fill it with scandal. Their fall did not reveal hidden history. It revealed how easily hidden history can be manufactured when an institution can no longer defend the meaning of its own past. That is the real darkness of the episode. The trials did not settle the mystery of the Templars. They multiplied it. They created documents that cannot be read innocently, because pain and pressure stand behind so many of the words. They created accusations too vivid to forget and too compromised to trust. They turned the Order from a historical institution into a screen onto which later centuries could project almost anything. Guardians of the Ark, heretics, bankers with swords, victims of royal greed, keepers of forbidden knowledge, martyrs to politics. The evidence supports some of these images better than others, but the reason the Templars endure is that their end left no clean emotional resolution. A quiet administrative closure would not have produced the same afterlife. Their destruction was public, violent, humiliating, and unresolved in the imagination. It invited people to suspect that the official story was incomplete. And perhaps it was incomplete, not because a golden ark stood behind it, but because power rarely tells the whole truth about its own appetite. By the time the Order disappeared, the Templars had become more useful as legend than they had ever been as men. Their silence was now permanent. Their secrets, real or imagined, no longer had living guardians who could explain them plainly. The chamber was empty, the record damaged, and the world was left with a question it could not resist decorating. What had they really been hiding? Chapter 13. Documents, relics, or nothing at all. By the time the Templars had been arrested, interrogated, dissolved, and scattered into memory, the question of what they might have found beneath Jerusalem had become almost impossible to separate from what people wanted them to have found. That is the difficulty with legends born from silence. They do not remain still. They absorb every later fear, every political betrayal, every missing record, every rumor that arrives dressed as a clue. And after enough centuries, the original question begins to change shape. It is no longer only, did the Templars find the Ark? It becomes broader, less theatrical, and more useful. What could they realistically have found? The answer begins with restraint. They may have encountered architectural remains. That is entirely plausible in the broad sense. Jerusalem is a city built over, around, and through earlier versions of itself. A group living near the Temple Mount might have seen old stones, reused masonry, underground spaces, cisterns, fragments of construction, or traces of earlier occupation. None of this would require conspiracy. It would require only proximity to one of the most layered urban landscapes in the world. But architectural remains are not the Ark of the Covenant. A carved stone, a blocked passage, a water system, or an ancient foundation can be meaningful without being miraculous. The danger comes when every fragment is forced to become a key. One old chamber becomes a hiding place. One strange mark becomes a code. One absence becomes deliberate concealment. This is how careful inquiry turns into mythology with a shovel in its hand. They may also have found minor religious objects. That, too, is possible in a general way. Sacred cities accumulate things. Lamps, vessels, inscriptions, decorative fragments, devotional objects, broken fittings, pieces moved from one building to another. War, renovation, reuse, and neglect can scatter objects far from their original settings. A medieval brother might have seen something ancient and not fully understood its date, origin, or meaning. But again, possibility is not proof. There is no verified object, no securely documented relic, no surviving chain of custody that allows us to say, here is what the Templars recovered from beneath the Temple Mount, and here is how it changed their fate. The story becomes weaker the moment it tries to turn atmosphere into inventory. Documents are another favorite possibility. This version is less visually dramatic than the Ark, but in some ways more seductive. Perhaps, the theory goes, the Templars discovered hidden texts, ancient writings, temple records, forbidden knowledge, genealogies, maps, theological secrets, or documents capable of threatening kings and churches. This idea has flourished because documents feel more believable than a golden chest and more dangerous than a broken pot. A document can be copied, hidden, interpreted, and weaponized. It can survive as knowledge even if the original disappears, but the evidence remains thin. No reliable medieval source proves that the Order discovered a secret archive under the Temple Mount. No confirmed text can be traced from an ancient Jerusalem hiding place into Templar hands. Later speculation often reveals more about modern fascination with suppressed knowledge than about the 12th century itself. We like the idea that power depends on a hidden file, a lost manuscript, one explosive truth locked away from ordinary people. It makes history feel like a locked office rather than a broken landscape. What the Templars certainly did possess were records of their own world. Charters, donations, property rights, accounts, privileges, correspondence, legal instruments, and administrative memory. Those documents were powerful, but not because they exposed ancient secrets. They were powerful because they made the Order durable. A signed donation can shape history more effectively than a mysterious parchment no one can verify. A network of property can outlast a rumor. A privilege granted by authority can move wealth more reliably than a legend. That may sound less exciting, but it is closer to how power usually works. The least glamorous possibility is also the one that must remain on the table. They may have found nothing of importance at all, not nothing in the emotional sense. No one lives near this Temple Mount and finds nothing, if by that word we mean no atmosphere, no memory, no sense of historical pressure. But materially, they may not have uncovered any relic, archive, sacred vessel, or object capable of explaining their rise. They may have lived, prayed, trained, guarded, repaired, stored supplies, used the spaces available to them, and left behind only the ordinary marks of occupation. For legend, that is almost unbearable. We prefer the missing treasure to the empty room. We prefer the hidden document to the administrative charter. We prefer a secret origin to a gradual accumulation of support. But sometimes the empty room tells the deeper truth. It reveals the hunger we bring to the past. It shows how badly we want history to reward our curiosity with a central object. The Templar Ark story survives because every sober answer feels incomplete to the imagination. Architectural remains? Too small. Minor relics? Too ordinary. Documents? Possible but unproven. Nothing? Too cold. The Ark? Magnificent and unsupported. This is where the narrator has to be honest, even at the risk of disappointing the myth. No verified evidence proves that the Templars discovered the Ark of the Covenant. No reliable record places it in their possession. No known artifact closes the chain from the First Temple to the Order's headquarters in Crusader Jerusalem. The claim remains legend, speculation, and symbolic association rather than established history. And yet, the question refuses to die because it rests on something real. Not a proven object, but a real convergence. The Ark truly was tied to the memory of the ancient sanctuary. The Templars truly were associated with the temple area in Crusader Jerusalem. Their order truly became wealthy, disciplined, privileged, and secretive in the eyes of outsiders. Their fall truly involved accusation, coercion, political pressure, and damaged records. These facts do not prove the legend, but they create the conditions in which the legend feels almost natural. That distinction is everything. A false claim can attach itself to real history so closely that removing it feels like damaging the story. But careful history does not destroy mystery. It refines it. It asks us to stop treating the Ark as a missing prop and start seeing why it became the perfect explanation for a much larger anxiety. The real question is not only what lay beneath the Temple Mount, it is why later generations were so certain something had to be there. Maybe the Templars found fragments of stone. Maybe they found objects whose meanings are lost to us. Maybe they found documents of local importance that never became world-shaking secrets. Maybe they found nothing but the practical underground of an old sacred city. Or maybe the most important discovery was made by everyone after them. The discovery that a powerful order, placed beside a vanished holy object and then destroyed under suspicion, could never again be remembered simply. The Ark remains unverified in their story. The empty spaces remain empty, but the imagination keeps returning, lowering its lamp, searching the same darkness for a shape it already knows by heart. Chapter 14. The Real Treasure Beneath the Legend. The most tempting treasure in this story is the one no one can prove. That is why it shines so brightly. A golden ark beneath Jerusalem offers the perfect shape for mystery. Sacred, lost, dangerous, and simple enough to hold in the mind. It gives the Templars a secret center. It turns their rise into a revelation, their wealth into evidence, their silence into strategy, and their fall into the final act of a drama that began under the Temple Mount. But history, when handled carefully, does not give us that clean satisfaction. What it gives us is something less spectacular and perhaps more powerful. The Templars stood at an intersection few institutions have ever occupied. They were born from conquest, clothed in religion, armed for war, trusted with money, protected by privilege, and named for one of the most symbolically charged places in biblical memory. Their true treasure was not necessarily something hidden in a chamber. It was the authority created by standing where scripture, violence, devotion, and political need met. That kind of authority cannot be placed in a reliquary. It spreads. It spreads through donations made by people who will never see Jerusalem, through charters signed in distant halls, through young men who enter the order believing their swords can serve salvation, through kings who need disciplined fighters, through churchmen who need a language for holy war, through frightened pilgrims who want someone between their bodies and the dangers of the road. The Templars became powerful because they gave form to a medieval longing, the longing to make the sacred defensible. That is easy to miss if we stare only at the Ark. The Ark draws the eye because it is singular. One object, one question, one possible hiding place. But the real machinery of Templar power was distributed across an entire world. It lived in estates, rules, vows, fortresses, banking practices, papal approvals, noble generosity, and the emotional magnetism of Jerusalem itself. In other words, the treasure was not under them. It was around them. The Temple Mount gave the order a name. The Crusades gave it a mission. The Church gave it legitimacy. Donors gave it resources. War gave it urgency. Secrecy gave it mystique. And over time, enemies gave it a darker afterlife than any official chronicle could have planned. The Ark became the perfect symbol for all of this because it condensed authority into an image. It represented divine presence, hidden law, ancient kingship, sacred danger, and the lost heart of the temple. To attach that symbol to the Templars was to say, in one gesture, that these men had touched the root of power, not ordinary power, not merely money or land or military command, power with a sacred ancestry. That is why the legend endured even without proof. It expressed something people sensed about the order. The Templars seemed to possess more weight than their visible structure could explain. They were not simply soldiers, not simply monks, not simply bankers, not simply landholders. They were a contradiction made institutional, and contradictions invite hidden explanations. The Ark supplied one. But the grounded answer is more unsettling in its own way. The Templars did not need to find the Ark to become dangerous in the medieval imagination. They only needed to show that sacred stories could organize real power. They showed that a place remembered through scripture could generate money across Europe. They showed that religious vows could discipline violence. They showed that poverty, when institutionalized, could accumulate wealth. They showed that men without private heirs could build an organization that outlived individual ambition. This was the real discovery, not a lost object, but a method. A method of turning memory into authority. The Temple Mount did not have to yield a relic. Its meaning was already enough. Its association with Solomon's temple placed the Templars inside a story older than the Crusades and larger than any Crusader king. Even after Jerusalem was lost, that association traveled with them. It clung to their name, their reputation, and their silence. And silence is important here. Not because it proves conspiracy, but because silence changes the way power is perceived. When ordinary institutions are quiet, they may seem dull. When powerful sacred institutions are quiet, people suspect depth. The Templars' internal discipline, their restricted rights, their financial reach, and their unusual privileges all created a surface onto which outsiders could project fear. The Ark became a way of naming that fear. It suggested that the Order's authority came from somewhere it should not. From beneath the temple. From before the church. From a divine presence no king could tax and no pope could fully command. That was the fantasy. But fantasies endure when they speak to real anxieties. And the anxiety was real. Medieval Europe had to ask what happens when a religious order becomes too wealthy, too military, too autonomous, and too symbolically protected to be easily challenged. The Templars forced that question into public life. Their downfall did not answer it cleanly. It only made the question more poisonous. So perhaps the real treasure beneath the legend is not a thing at all, but an insight into how history manufactures mystery. First, an object disappears from the record. Then a place remains sacred after the object is gone. Then an order lives near that place. Then the order becomes wealthy and strange. Then the order is destroyed under accusation. And finally, later generations connect the gaps. No one step proves the Ark was found. But together, the steps create a path the imagination cannot resist walking. That is why the Templar legend still feels alive. It is not built entirely out of fantasy. It is built from real absences, real locations, real power, real secrecy, and real violence. The unsupported claim sits on top of a foundation that is historically solid enough to make the whole structure feel plausible from a distance. But when we move closer, the Ark remains out of reach. What comes into focus instead is the power of sacred geography itself. The Templars discovered, or perhaps simply inhabited, the authority created when men stand near a place the world already believes is holy. They became proof that memory can be organized, that absence can be monetized, that a vanished sanctuary can still command armies, donations, fear, and loyalty centuries after its destruction. The Ark was the perfect symbol because it was missing. Had it been found, it would have become an artifact. Debated, guarded, perhaps doubted, perhaps damaged by the ordinary world. But missing, it could remain unlimited. It could explain everything and nothing. It could be invoked without being inspected. It could live in the space between evidence and desire. The Templars did not create that space. They entered it. And once they did, they became part of the mystery the Ark had left behind. Chapter 15. The Empty Chamber. The Ark is still missing. After all the names, all the ruins, all the vows, all the accusations, that fact remains unchanged. No verified discovery has placed it in the hands of the Templars. No reliable record has carried it from the Holy of Holies into a medieval treasury. No recovered object has closed the distance between the destroyed First Temple and the armed monks who lived near the place later Christians associated with Solomon's sanctuary. The chamber, historically speaking, is empty, and yet the emptiness has never felt empty. That is the strange power of this story. The Ark vanished from dependable history centuries before the Templars existed, but its absence continued to shape what people could imagine. Jerusalem kept the memory alive. The Temple Mount kept the question anchored to a place. The Crusades gave that place new political heat. The Templars gave the mystery a human form, disciplined, secretive, armed, wealthy, and eventually destroyed. They were almost too perfect for the legend. Not because they were proven guardians of the Ark, but because they stood close enough to the memory of it. They lived where sacred geography, conquest, and longing touched. They rose from poverty into influence. They served the church, handled money, fought wars, answered to vows, and kept their inner life largely closed to outsiders. Then, when they fell, their silence became permanent. History left gaps. The world filled them. That may be the most honest answer this mystery allows. The Templars probably did not discover the Ark of the Covenant, at least not in any way the evidence can support. What they did discover, or what their story reveals, is how much authority can gather around a sacred absence. A missing object can become more powerful than an object on display. A lost sanctuary can command imagination long after its walls are gone. A place can make men seem deeper than their records. The Ark became the perfect symbol for the Templars because it carried everything their legend needed: hidden law, divine presence, royal legitimacy, forbidden access, and silence. It was not simply lost. It was lost in the right way, from the right place, with enough holiness attached to it that every later generation could suspect the truth had merely been concealed. But there is a discipline in not forcing the mystery to confess. The Temple Mount remains one of the most layered and contested sacred spaces on earth. Jewish memory, Islamic devotion, Christian interpretation, archaeology, politics, and grief all meet there in ways no simple treasure story can contain. To reduce it to a hiding place for a relic is to make it smaller than it is. To reduce the Templars to secret keepers of the Ark is to miss the more difficult truth. They became legendary because they stood inside a world where faith and power were already impossible to separate. So the story ends without the object. No golden chest lifted into torchlight. No final document breaking open the case. No clean solution waiting beneath a stone. Only a silence that has lasted long enough to become part of history itself. And perhaps that is why the legend survives. Not because the Templars found the Ark, but because they arrived near the place where people most wanted it to be. They stood close to the wound of its disappearance. Their rise made the rumor tempting. Their fall made it immortal. In the end, the most haunting possibility is not that they uncovered the lost Ark beneath Jerusalem. It is that they never had to. History's silence did the work for them.